The reading today comes from James 1:17 to 27. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of all he created. My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. Therefore, get rid of all moral filth and the evil that is so prevalent, and humbly accept the word planted in you, which can save you. Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. Anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like someone who looks at his face in a mirror. And and after looking at himself, goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. But whoever looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom and continues in it, not forgetting what they have heard, but doing it, they will be blessed in what they do. Those who consider themselves religious and yet do not keep a tight rein on their tongues deceive themselves, and their religion is worthless. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. Amen.
Amen. Thank you for that, Margaret. We're going to have a look at this passage a bit more, and I want to start off by acknowledging a little bit about the book of James. We're looking at the book of James at the moment in our lay preachers course, and in fact, in 2 weeks' time, we got a group where we're going to talk about whether or not James should even be in the Bible. Now, you might not know this, but in fact, there were times when, in fact, James was almost left out. In fact, twice, or two main times. The first time was when they were actually working out the canon, working out what should be in the Bible. They wanted to leave out some books, and it was the book of Revelation and the book of James that wanted to be left out. And then, of course, during the Reformation, we had Martin Luther. Martin Luther came along, and he wanted to translate the Bible from the Latin and from the Greek and Hebrew and into German. And he was translating it, and he got to these books, and he wanted to leave out the book of James. In fact, he called the book of James a gospel of straw. Essentially only good for the cattle, not so much for the human beings. The human beings, it had nothing in it. And I've thought about that, and I when I was doing, in fact, I've been thinking about it for the lay preachers course, but I've been thinking about it in terms of this passage, and I went through this week and read through James itself, and in some ways I can understand what Martin Luther was on about, because it's really not a book about developing faith. It's not a book about faith itself. It's not a book about how we become Christians. It's not even a book about how we grow, particularly in understanding of God or understanding of connection. But then I realized that every congregation has someone like James in them. and they're a pain. Let me just say that they're a pain. It's much nicer to not have someone like James. It's to have someone like John instead. Now, I just need to say from the beginning that this James is most probably not the one that's connected to John. So, when it says John and James or James and John, it's most probably not that James. This James is most probably, or at least a lot of people think, is actually one of the siblings of Jesus, the brother of Jesus, as in James. And I'm not going to get into the arguments about which one it is, but it's kind of like you always have one of these in every family. You have one of these in every church. You have a James. I think it would be much better if everybody was just John. Wouldn't that be great? Lovely and spiritual and giving spiritual words and lovely images of, I am the great and the gate and I am the shepherd and so on. And we can all come to church and we can all be wonderfully spiritual. And we can all have little, kind of leather-bound floppy Bibles, and we can have these little Bible meetings that meet inside the church, and we can make sure the church is a happy, spiritual place where everybody speaks to each other with such lovely spiritual connection. Isn't that lovely? And I know most of you are saying, so what's he on about? Well, the thing is, you see, you always have a James as well, though. You have that person who says, we need to get out into the community. We need to go out and do something. And, something happens somewhere in the world and you get that person who says, now, what are we doing about this? What are we going to, what's our response? How are we going to respond to the Aboriginal question? How are we going to respond to Afghanistan? How are we going to do these things? You always have those people, but that I always find them, goodness me, that's too tricky, isn't it? But the truth of it is that when I look at those people, when I look at the connections with them, you always have those people who say, let's stop talking about Christianity and we have to go and do it. Go and do it. And a lot of times you actually want to say to those people, just relax, calm down. It's kind of interesting. A few months ago, one of the couples in our congregation left us. And they went to another congregation, a different congregation from us. And when they wrote me an email to tell me that they were leaving, essentially that's what they were saying. They were saying that we weren't doing enough. We weren't getting out there and making enough happen. And it really kind of got to me. I kind of went, what? What are we not doing? And then when I read this passage in James, I realize maybe that's the thing, isn't it? That why James is in the Bible. I think it's the reason why James is in there is that even though it's not talking about how we become Christians, it's absolutely talking about how we're supposed to live as Christians. It's talking about the fact that it's no use just saying I'm a Christian and not actually living it out. As my friend always used to say, that just because you live in a garage and drink oil doesn't make you a car. Saying that you believe in Jesus by itself actually isn't all that it is about being a Christian. Notice what he says. He says, don't just listen to the word, do it. Do what it says. Do what it says. And I think that's where there's a gulf in for most of us as Christians, is there's a gulf between what we are and what we do, what we claim to be and what we actually go out and exercise. And I think that's where this passage wants to help us. And it's using that by giving us an image to begin with. And in the beginning of verse 18, or at the end of verse 18, it says that we might be a kind of first fruits of all he created, a kind of first fruits. Now, when you look at that, you can get a bit arrogant and say, well, I'm the first fruits. Or you can realize that first fruits is actually a sacrificial, it's a tithing concept within the Jewish culture. So within the Jewish culture, what would happen is that in this period, so now kind of as we come into spring, so you would have the first fruits of what's been happening over winter. So you would start having the spring lambs, which are being born. Next Sunday is, of course, the first Sunday in spring. And the idea of it is that your first fruits is the first thing that you give, is the first connection. Too often what we look at in Christ is we give Christ what's left over. We give Christ what we can afford. We give Christ what's left after we've given everything to everybody else. Then what's left over, we then give something of that to Jesus. Notice the image here is the first fruits. That if we're going to live out our Christian life, that we actually live it out by giving the first of our life to Christ. That it's a gift, a sacrifice. It's a tithe to the Lord. That's the image that James wants to give us here. The image of saying, how do we give the first of our life to Christ. Well, how? What are the things that we need to do in order to live that way? Well, number one is that we need to be quick to listen. That we need to be quick to listen. Now, I guarantee that if you ask most people will claim that they are good listeners. Most people would claim they're good listeners. The truth of it is that for most of us, we're not great listeners. We're not great listeners. I know that for a fact because I keep on saying the same thing over and over again, and then people call me up and say, so when is that happening again? What's the time? And I realized that people weren't listening. They weren't listening to it. I see it for myself, is that I realize that how quickly I get distracted. And it's interesting about distraction, isn't it? Is that we often are distracted. I love watching the congregation. It's one of the reasons why I used to walk around in the front of the congregation, because I could look at people straight in the eye. And I could watch it when their eyes moved away. You know, I could watch when they got a little glassy. You know, when whatever I was saying had moved away and they were thinking about lunch. Or they were thinking about what they're going to do after lunch. And I could see when that was happening. I had a friend of mine at university who could take any short story and make it into a novel. You know those people. You say, how are you doing? And you learn not to ask him that, because if you do, you're going to be there for a while. So unless you've got that kind of time, don't ask the question. But he could spin any question, any story into a long one. And I remember getting caught out one day with him because I was standing there and he came along and all my friends just disappeared and I was left alone with him, because it kind of happens that way. And he started talking. And as he started talking, and I realized that I just drifted away. And then, when somebody is talking to you, when you're not really paying attention, when they're asking a question, and of course the sentence goes up at the end and you realize, oh, he's asked me a question. And I went, yes. And the answer to the question was actually supposed to be no. At which point he accused me then of not listening. And of course, whenever you accuse someone of not listening, what's their first reaction? Oh, no, I was. We get all defensive about it. Of course, you're only going to get defensive because you're lying. That's the reality. But I realized that I wasn't listening. I was actually thinking about something else. The other reason why we don't listen often is because we're preparing what we're going to say. Someone's coming to talk to you, and in fact, you're not listening to them because you want to get a word in. You want to get your thing said. And then, of course, what you have is two competing conversations where each person's trying to speak rather than to be heard. But you see, I think that one of the basic things that we do as Christians, one of the basic things that we have to do and connect with as Christians, if we're going to live out the life of Christ, is to learn to listen. My mother always used to say, Martin, you've got 2 ears and 1 mouth. Use them in that proportion. So I showed her, I became a minister, and now I can talk for, all the time. But, the thing with it is that when it comes down to it, though, is that learning to listen. And notice what he carries on with learning to listen. He says, be slow to speak and then slow to become angry. Isn't it interesting that he puts those together? That we listen, not speak, and then not become angry. Because you see, so often when we become angry, that's when we speak. That's not when we listen. It's when we're angry that we then go and say things that later on we look back on and say, I wish I didn't say that. I wish I hadn't said that. But by then, what you've said has already gone out. How many places in our lives are the way they are because we failed to listen? And we spoke when we were angry instead of listening. But you see, I think that that's what this passage is wanting to tell us, is that the first fruits that we can have of living out the Christian faith is by learning to listen to each other. And that's listening to everybody, listening to those who we disagree with before we judge them and execute. To listen to those who maybe have hurt us so that we understand where that pain is coming from, so we can understand where what they said came from. To realize that the response to our anger is not just to vent it onto somebody else, but in fact, to be slow to speak. So that in fact, we don't speak out of our anger. We instead speak out of our desire to reconcile and to reconnect in relationship. See, when I look at Christ, when I look at Jesus, that's what I see. I see somebody who speaks when he's listened. The one thing I love about Jesus is that he keeps on asking questions. And it's in the questions, that those responses to the questions, that he's able to bring about change and transformation, whether it be in the Syrophoenician woman's life, whether it be in the demoniac in Gadarene. In each of those places, he listens to those people and then responds to them, and they can bring about change in relationship and purpose. You know, you'll change people more by listening to them than ever you think by talking to them. We need to be quick to listen. Secondly, it says those who hear the word but don't do it is like a person who looks in a mirror and immediately forgets what he looks like. Now, for some of us, that might actually be a good thing. Especially it's sometimes in the morning, when I get up in the morning and look at myself in the mirror, sometimes I want to forget what I've just seen. But the issue with it is that obviously you're looking in the mirror for a reason. You're looking to actually see for some reason. But here's the one that I love. I love the way in which he puts it. He says that we need to nurture the word that has been planted in us. To nurture the word. I like that. You see, because I think that's the second thing that we do. First, we listen. Secondly, we nurture the word that has been planted within us. And I think that nurturing of the word that we've heard, that as we've listened to Jesus, not only listen to each other, but as we listen to the word, as we read the Bible, as we spend time in prayer, as we hear that, as that word is within us, let's nurture the word that has been planted within us. Now, I've told you many times that I'm really not a gardener of any note whatsoever. But I've been so excited to watch our roses grow in the front of our garden. The roses definitely feel that spring is on the way, because they're shooting up. And it's almost as if you can almost watch them grow. You know, every couple of days you look at them and they've actually grown a bit more, and there's more leaves on them, and there's more sense of life that's returning. I went and got myself a worm farm. You know, it's one of the reasons why we wanted to keep Bunnings open, isn't it? You know, so we can get this kind of thing. And so we've got the worm farm, and it produces this manure, this fertilizer that we can put them. I've been putting them onto each of the rose bushes so that they can get, can keep going. It's been kind of fun to nurture it. For somebody who's not a gardener, that's been fun. But you see, I think that we all need to be gardeners of our souls. That we need to be nurturing the word within us. We need to be spending time with it. We need to allow that word to speak to us and to go from seed into root and into tree, so that it actually connects with the rest of our lives. That means we need to spend time with it. This week, when I sent out the email on Saturday, I sent out a Bible reading guide with you. It was written by a friend of mine called Neil Oosthuizen. Neil was a Methodist minister who trained with me. And he and his wife looked after me a lot when I was at university, because I was 17 and they were already married and living in married quarters. And every now and then they would invite me for dinner so that I would actually have a good meal instead of the usual institutional meal that I was having. And I grew close to both of them. And it was lovely to spend time with them in that way. And he and I would have arguments about the Old Testament, particularly because he was a doctorate in the Old Testament. And it was wonderful. And he wrote this particular guide for the Bible, which cuts out a lot of the bits of the Bible and tries to read it instead as one story from beginning to end. And I want to encourage you to read that. I want to encourage you to use it maybe as a way to read the Bible as a narrative, as a chronological story, and put it together. For me, it's a legacy for Neil. Because about 5 years ago, Neil was riding his motorcycle and he was taken out by a truck. And so that's why I want to keep his legacy alive in that reading guide as well, because that was his particular thing, is that he wanted people to read the Bible, and particularly to read the Old Testament, the Tanakh. He went too soon. But I pray that his legacy may be that we may seek to nurture the word within us. That as he wrote that little guide to help us to read the Bible in another way, I pray that we may do that. In this time of lockdown, come on, maybe this is a good opportunity to get into the word, to allow the Bible to actually take root within us so that we may actually connect with it. We may connect with where it's going. But you see, that's what this passage is saying, is that one of the things that we need to do is to nurture the word that has been planted within us. Thirdly, this is the one that's interesting at the end of it. He says, what is a pure and faultless faith? What is a faith that is acceptable? So a religion that's acceptable to God, that's pure and faultless. And when we ask ourselves that question, we might get a whole lot of questions about, well, not having sin and not doing the thing that's wrong and so on. And we couch so often purity and faultlessness in the negative. But you notice that he doesn't do that in James. That in James he says, what does it mean to be a pure and faultless faith? He says to look after orphans and widows and to not be polluted by this world. And I unpack that for myself. What it's actually telling us is that the third aspect, so we listen, we nurture, and then thirdly, we act. We act, and we act particularly for those who can't act for themselves. The thing with the widows and the orphans in the time of Jesus was that they had no one to look after them. They had no one to protect them. They had no one to fend for them. They had no one to speak for them. And yet that's what James is saying we are called to do. We are called to speak for them. We are called to act for them. We are called to connect with them. It says to not be polluted by the world. What polluted means is to actually be washed out, be made less than what we should be. I was interested to read the other day about pollution at the moment in the world. And they're saying now that in some of the deepest trenches in the world, so some of the deepest parts of the sea, they've actually found traces of plastic. You look at it, you go, what? There's plastic at the bottom of these trenches? Now, for me, I can believe that. In 1991, when I came to Australia the first time, I was on my way to the island called Nauru. And I was part of the CWM work camp, so the Council for World Mission. And we went to Nauru to have a conference there all about climate change. This was in 1991. That's 30 years ago, we were talking about climate change. So if you think that that's new, it's absolutely not. But one of the things that we were doing while we were there was to actually help the locals a bit. And one of the things that Nauru never had was a regular garbage collection system. So what that would mean is that when the locals would go to the beach, they would actually just leave all their litter behind. And so when we went to this beach to go and help clean it up, it was covered in beer cans. I mean, and when I say covered in beer cans, I mean covered in beer cans. And they were all Fosters. I only realized later on that Australians actually don't drink Fosters. They just export it to every other country. But the issue with it is that it was covered in beer cans, and we collected all the beer cans. I mean, it took us two whole days of working, of this whole group. There were 50 of us in the group, all collecting beer cans. And it took us 2 days to collect all the beer cans. And there were bags and bags and bags of it. anyway, it was a few years later that I received a call from, well, I received a letter, in fact, in those days still, from one of the people who had been part of that group, a lady by the name of Bluneldi Hiram. And she sent me a letter saying, thank you so much for coming and for all. It was great to see you all. And then she said, unfortunately, this is what the beach looks like now. And it was covered again in beer cans. Because in fact, nothing had changed, you see. People's attitudes hadn't changed. The garbage collection system hadn't changed. And so the truth of it is that everything went back to what it had been before. And you see, I think that what this passage is telling us is to stop things from going back to what they were before. We have to have a change of attitude. We have to have a change in the core of ourselves, not just in the outworking. Because otherwise what happens is we do it now, but then we go straight back to not doing it again. See, I think that what this passage is trying to call us to is a change of attitude, a change of mind, that we would actually look after those in distress, that we would want to do that we would want to change the attitudes and the processes that actually got them in distress in the first place. That's what it means to not be polluted by the world. It's not just taking away the beer cans, but it's also trying to find the ways to stop the beer cans from being there in the first place. And so that's where this passage wants to talk to us about being first fruits. That we need to give the first fruit of our life to Christ, not what's left over at the end. We need to give the first energy to Christ. And in that energy, we need to learn to be quick to listen. To be quick to listen, rather than to be quick to speak. Secondly, we need to nurture the word that has been planted within us. You know, it's interesting that we spend so much time doing so many other things and so little time actually finding out about God's word to us, whether that be in the Bible or whether that be in prayer. We need to spend time with Christ so that we may nurture that which we have received. And then having listened, having nurtured, we need to go and live a faith that is pure and faultless. Not by never sinning, but by changing our attitude so that we seek to look after those who can't look after themselves. That we seek to actually stop ourselves from being polluted by the world, but to respond to that world in that way. And you know, I think that as we do that, so we will grow in faith. But most of all, so the kingdom will grow as we show love and compassion and care to the world around us. And may God bless us as we seek to do that.